I'm on. No, yes, I'm on.
Okay, good.
Let's have a word of prayer. For the newness of this day, God, we give you thanks. For the freshness of the gospel, which comes to us and makes us new every day, we pause to give you thanks. Now send the Spirit that guided Mark to write these words, and the Spirit that works in our hearts and souls and minds, that we might be inspired with your word and learn to see what it means to be your followers and your disciples. For your presence and your power and Spirit, we give you thanks. And all of God's people said, Amen. Well, this is a day you should have brought your crash helmets or your seat belts. This is not a mild kind of text from Mark, which relates to Paul. These are some tough words. We're now in the middle of the Gospel of Mark, and so we have a shift. Up to this point, we've been basically in Galilee and had some parables and lots of healing, lots of work of Jesus. But most of the time after it happens, he says, shh, don't tell anybody this. And now today it becomes crystal clear why he doesn't want them to tell it. Because they only have half the story. The other half of the story begins here in the 8th chapter of Mark and runs to the 16th. And it's all about what it means for Jesus to have authority, to be the Son of God, and it's all about what it means for us to be disciples and believers and followers. And so I said you'd bring your Christ helmets because it's no picnic. There's something more to being a Christian than simply sitting here and listening to the nice words of the thing that Jesus has done. That's good and important, but it's not the whole story. So the whole story comes to us today. It begins as Jesus predicts his suffering and death on the cross and the need for that and what it means for us to deny ourselves and pick up a cross and follow him. So we are dealing with the question of what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean for Jesus to have authority and be the Christ? So let's just kind of set ourselves in the New Testament in the middle of all of this. And so we'll do a little brief summary of what it means to be a Christian in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. For John and the Apostle Paul, to be a Christian is to be a believer. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, whoever believed in him would not perish but have eternal life. And you can't read 16 without 17. For God sent his Son into the world not to be its judge, but to be its Savior. And then Matthew wants to be sure that we're obedient to the law, and he has the Sermon on the Mount, and he emphasizes the place of obedience to the faith. And then we come to the compassionate one, Luke. We'll just take a brief look at his two great parables that we know. The Good Samaritan. You remember the story? The man's on his road from Lake Havasu City to Parker. And halfway down he gets pulled over and beaten up. And then the Catholic priest comes by, looks at his watch and knows he has to get to Mass. So he honks his horn and he said, "God bless you," and passes by on the other side. Then there's a Lutheran pastor And he comes by, and he has a newer car than the priest, and he has leather seats, and he doesn't want to get those damaged, so he doesn't want to take time to stop and beat up somebody who might be bleeding, so he says a nice prayer and goes on his way. And a Samaritan, an outcast. I don't know if he's homeless or he's a migrant worker. But he's somewhere on our totem pole when we want to judge people, not near the top. But he stops and has compassion, right? He bandages up the guy, he puts him on he calls the EMS and they come and pick him up, and he says, if you need any more money, here's some time to take care of him. When I come back through, I'll stop by him. And you see, a Sunday school teacher asked the question of Jesus, what does it mean to be a neighbor? And the Sunday school teacher said, well, I think it's that immigrant. Go and do likewise. So to be a Christian for Luke is to stop along the roadside and get involved with the people who are broken and hurt. And then we have the most famous parable in my mind that I love the most, and that's the parable of the prodigal son. The father had 2 sons. Remember the story? The young one says, let's pretend, Dad, that you died. Then I can have my inheritance right now. That's what he wants, his inheritance. So he takes the money and he goes off to Chicago. He's heard all about Rush Street and all the bars and all the wonderful things that are there. And he's the hit of the town. He's got all this money. He goes in and buys everybody a drink. And then one day he wakes up and he's out of money. And he doesn't know what he's going to do. Well, then he gets this revelation. If I hitchhike home, maybe I could work as a hired man on my dad's farm. Doesn't ask to be restored as a son. So Dad, he's on the front porch in the rocking chair. And he's hoping and praying that someday this son of his will come back. He sees a car stop down by the mailbox, and he rubs his eyes, and he thinks, he looks, oh, I think that's my son. So he throws his cane down, which he usually used to walk, and sprints as fast as he can to greet his son. And he says, that son of mine who is lost and is now found, so let's have a party. The neighbors up the street didn't understand this. Why would you have a party for a guy who ran and took his inheritance? And he forgave him, and he restored him to sonship. Wow, what a story. So, what does it mean to be a Christian? To help the lost get found, to live out the gospel. And then we come to Mark today. And Mark is a strong one. He's the one that's filled with courage. He's the one who doesn't mince around. He wants to tell the truth. And that's what he's going to do for us today. He's going to tell the truth. So we have 3 stories in a row in chapters 8, 9, and 10, which predict Jesus' death on the cross, his suffering and his pain, and his death on the cross, and then his resurrection. Now you have to understand that when he talks about being crucified, that doesn't go over well with any of the people. Because you know what the Romans did. They didn't sell billboards for some shaving cream or some grocery store on the highway into town. Their billboards were crosses with crucified people on them. And after they died, they left them there for a while to remind all the people that Rome was in charge and you shouldn't go against us. Crucifixion was clear and evident for them in that day. They could see it, where it was, and what it meant for them. And so when they talk about crucifixion, they're talking about being put to death through pain and suffering. So let's go to the story. We'll do the first one today, but we have to understand this about that. These three stories in Mark's gospel are put together and bracketed by two miracles of healing so you could see. Mark does it that way because he knows these people can't see what Jesus is trying to say. Matter of fact, it takes a process. The first miracle is healing, and it's a two-part miracle, the only one in the whole New Testament that doesn't get healed on the first go. He has to have a second shot at it, because he's reminding those people that to understand what it means to be a follower and a believer of Jesus is going to take more than one look. So let's begin. 8th chapter, 22nd verse, the first healing story. They came to Bethsaida. Some people brought a blind man to him and begged him to touch him. He took the blind man by the hand and led him out of the village. And then he put saliva on his eyes and laid his hands on him. He asked him, "Can you see anything?" A man looked up and said, "I can see people, but they look like trees, and they're walking." Then Jesus laid his hands on his eyes again, and he looked intently, and his sight was restored, and he saw everything clearly. Then he sent him away to his home, saying, "Do not even go into the village." And then these things end at the end chapter of 10, and he has another blind man he heals. So the point of Mark putting this together in this way is that we know we better be able to see what Jesus is saying about picking up a cross and following him, denying yourself. So let's take a look then at Peter and Jesus. 27th verse. Jesus went on with his disciples to the village of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked the disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And they answered him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and still others, one of the prophets." No. You don't understand. I'm not asking your opinion of what someone else says. Jesus is really saying, I'm asking you. And he's asking you the same question today. Who do you say I am? Peter answered him, "You are the Messiah." And he sternly ordered them not to tell anyone about him. Then he began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be rejected by the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. He said this all quite openly. Well, then Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. But turning and looking at his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things." He called the crowd with his disciples and said to him, "If any of you want to become my followers, Let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake and for the sake of the gospel will save it. For what will profit them to gain the whole world and forfeit their life? Indeed, what can they give in return for their life? Those who are ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of them the Son of Man will also be ashamed when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels. And he said to them, truly I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God has come with power. Wow. The word rebuke is a strong word. Jesus rebukes what Peter says. Peter rebukes him too. Rebuke is used when Jesus calms the sea, stops the storm, heals the people along the way, casts out demons, does healing. Rebuke is that kind of word. So we have this conversation that goes on between Peter and Jesus. Well, can you imagine? Peter kind of looks over his shoulders and taps Jesus, and he's saying to his teacher, the Son of God, the divine and human one, you don't have it right. You aren't meeting my expectations. Have we ever kind of turned God off because he doesn't do it my way? Well, you're in the church, so it's truth-telling time. You probably have all done that. You just don't kind of get it the way you want it to be. So, Peter takes him on and says, this can't happen. You're not giving me my understanding of what the Messiah is and my expectations of that. I don't want any of these suffering and dying. I want you to come with all power and might and get rid of the Romans and bring the kingdom here right now. Well, Jesus says that isn't how it is. He tells this same story 3 times, and they still don't get it. They still don't get it until they seize him rise from the dead. And so Peter can't hear the whole story. All he hears about is pain and suffering. Is that how we are sometimes? We only hear the worst thing? Or are you in a different world than I am? And they can't hear the great blessing that he's going to rise from the dead. So Jesus turns around and talks to Peter, and he invites the other disciples in to say, you didn't get it right. You're going to have to suffer and die, and I'm going to have to be crucified on the cross. And you need to do 3 things. You need to do 3 things. You need to tell us, you need to listen to us with who you are. Let me get this right. You need to deny yourself, pick up your cross, and follow me. Now, what in the world does it mean to deny yourself? When I was a pastor in Williston, I had the great privilege and honor to, with my friend the Catholic priest, Father Wright, to teach humanities at the 2-year college extension of the University of North Dakota Williston Division. Can you imagine that? A Lutheran and a Catholic teaching humanities. Didn't they understand the difference between church and state? Dr. Stevens didn't. He wanted us, and we said, are we free to do whatever we want? And he said yes. Well, so I had some of those students ended up to come to church after I'd met them in class, and it was Lent. And so we were asking the question of denying yourself and, giving something up for Lent. So he listened to these wonderful Lutheran parishioners. We're going to make this gigantic sacrifice. Some of them were going to give up chocolate for Lent. Some of them were going to give up desserts for Lent. Some of them were going to give up their favorite TV show for Lent. And a couple of these students says, it doesn't sound like what Mark is saying in his gospel about denying. What does it mean then to deny? To get off your selfish self and get on the business of loving your neighbor and serving your neighbor? To deny self is more than giving up chocolate. To deny yourself is to say, I'm not in first place. To deny yourself is to say, my neighbor's needs are as important as my needs. To deny yourself is to do that. So what does it mean to pick up a cross and follow Jesus? We have crosses in every church. Well, that's not quite true. I had a all-day Saturday retreat for my confirmants who were, they were juniors in high school. I didn't do them too young. And so we did a retreat on a Saturday. We rented a couple of vans. This was in the Twin Cities. We're going to go and visit a bunch of churches. So I called the pastors or the priests or the rabbis, and I said, we're bringing by about 41 kids, and we'd like to look at your church, and we'd like you to tell us a little bit about what it is that you believe. That was interesting, We went to the Jewish synagogue. The rabbi was there. He was very, very insightful and interesting. We went to see the Methodists, and one of the kids that was raised, his mother was raised in a Methodist family, said, do you still teach here that you can't play cards and drink beer? And then we went on to some other churches, and then the last one we saw was this big mega church. It had a parking lot that you could have put in thousands of cars. Big, big auditorium. So we looked around and visited with the pastor, and one of the students asked him, well, how do you fill this place up on Sundays? And he said, well, you have to do something exciting. Kind of ended up saying, you just got to entertain these people. So we get all through with this. We get back to the church, and I said to these wonderful students, tell me what most impressed you on this day. Well, some said that I really liked the Jewish rabbi. I'd never heard a Jew say anything, and he was really kind to us and insightful. But the majority of those said the thing that they most were impressed was the big mega church did not have a cross in the sanctuary. And one of the kids said there was a cross in the back edge of the back parking lot, but not in the sanctuary. And so one of the kids said, do they worship Jesus there? I thought that's the main thing. Isn't the main thing that he came and gave his only son to die on the cross for us and to rise him from the dead? Isn't that what it's all based upon? I thought it was very insightful from them that they would take this up and look and see that there wasn't any cross there. Well, I'm not saying that judgmentally, even though it may sound that way. I'm just reporting the information to you. So when I've looked around at some megachurches, that's more the rule than not, that the cross is not center stage. In most Christian churches, you come in and can't help but see it when you come in, that it's the first thing you see. Because it's the first thing our faith is really all about, is that cross for us to see there, to see what's... So what in the world does it mean to pick up your cross and follow Jesus? We do this wonderful thing in most every Lutheran church I know. When we're ready to leave, we always have this wonderful saying about serving God, and we say thanks be to God after it's all over with. You know what I'm talking about when we leave? Well, two of these kids had an idea. They said, I don't think people understand this. Well, I said, they understand. They're leaving the sanctuary to go out and do their mission and to serve and to care and love for people. Well, these kids came up with the idea that the church should buy individual crosses they can carry around all week and store them in their narthex so when they leave, they could literally carry a cross with them so they wouldn't forget what they're supposed to be about. What do you think of that idea? You just have to write your church to Mount Olivet Lutheran Church for crosses, and maybe we could convince Craig we could do that. But the point is really present, I think, for us, that we got to be clear about this fact that we are carriers of the cross. We are people who real redemptive action is to volunteer to undertake our neighbors as ourselves. What does it mean to deny yourself? There's something more important in this world than Al Schoonover. There's something more important in this world than my own needs, as important as they may be. If I'm a follower of Jesus, then all people are my brothers and sisters. My favorite parable is a judgment parable, not even in Mark. It's in Matthew, the 25th chapter. Jesus comes in and judges, and he says, when I was hungry, you gave me something to eat. When as a stranger, you welcomed me. When I was in prison, you visited me. And you know the list goes on. And the people say, where did we see you like this? And Jesus said these words that you should never forget. Anything you have done to one of the least of these my brothers and sisters, you have done to me. You look into the face of every human being, and there you see the brother and sister of Jesus. That's where he's present. That's what it means to deny yourself and to pick up your cross and follow Jesus. Is to see Jesus in every human being. To see them, to be there, to be a part of that. So how is it then that we go about this business? giving up your own life so you can sacrifice God's love for others. Well, that happens here in the Gospels. In the 12th chapter, 22nd verse of Mark, you can check it out when you get home, there's a widow. And Jesus is looking all in the church, and he's sitting by where the offering baskets come. Would you like him to do that? Would you like him to sit here on Sunday and see what it is you put in your offering? You wouldn't have it in an envelope. You'd have to have it openly so Jesus could see what you were giving. Well, that's the story he tells. And he said there were many rich people that came that put in big contributions. But nothing was compared to this widow who had a few coins, and she gave all that she had. Who is the great giver? The biggest one? Or was it the widow who gave all that she had? Is that what it means to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow Jesus? And then we find that Jesus is on the way to the cross, and Simon of Cyrene is there, and Jesus is having trouble, and he goes out of his way and denies himself and picks up Jesus' cross and carries it the rest of the way up the hill. That's what it means. And then there's a blind man that he heals, and the blind man leaves his stuff alone and ends up following Jesus. That's what it means to deny yourself and follow Jesus. Or maybe it's like the man whose wife has some real concerns mentally. And some in the family said, it's just too big a burden for you to take care of her. Why don't you put her in a home? One of them says, why don't you just leave her? She can't do anything for you anyway. Aren't we wonderful people? And he says, no. That's what it means to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow you. Or the man who gave up his time at the bar with his friends after work to go and coach the basketball team at the grade school. And when he was there, he ran into some kids that had special needs, and he became their special friend. That's what it means to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow Jesus. Or maybe it's like the young college student who decided when he watched some kids that they were struggling with school, so he volunteered to be a mentor, to build a relationship with the kids, to teach them mathematics, but more importantly, to become their friend. That's what it means to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow Jesus, to see where that is. So who have you given your life to recently? So what else does it mean to deny yourself? They were in line at the airport. It was just before Christmas. It was busy. The line was long. The people were getting impatient. Can you imagine that? And they were upset. And there was a lady came up, and she walked to the head of the line and said, how long is there here? I've got my 2 kids, and if I don't catch this flight, I don't have another one till tomorrow, and I don't know what I'm going to do. The man 6 people from the beginning of the line said to the lady, "Come and take my place." What does it mean to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow Christ? It means to give up your rightful place in line for somebody who has a greater need than you have at that moment. You can find them everywhere you look, anywhere you are, to see what all that may mean for you. So we ask the question, who am I? I'm a disciple, trying to be, learning to be. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a follower of Jesus who wants to see in every human being that they're my brother and sister and part of my family of God with me. And I have to find a way to love them and care for them and allow them to be a part of my life, to see where I am. So, what are the other ways that you can deny yourself and be a part of Jesus Christ? When I know who Jesus is, I know who I am. When I know who I am as a believer, then I want to learn from this Jesus to see where I am. Do you look to him every day and say, to be most alive and most fruitful and most productive and to have a most meaningful life is to look to Jesus. To look and to see who he is and what he wants us to do. Isn't that true? When we give our way to take the time out and to give our way to some person in need or some other person who has some help, which is denying ourselves and picking up our cross, I often have to ask myself, who gets the most out of this? The person that I'm helping, or when I'm driving home and realizing that I've made a difference? I think often we get more out of it than they do, because that's what we were made for. That's what we were created for. That's what we're to do. That's what we're to be a part of. So who am I? I'm a child of God. I'm a follower of Jesus. I'm a learner of who Jesus is. So, when you're on the way to Parker next time, and you see somebody in trouble, it might be okay to stop. It just might be your brother and sister of Jesus. You got a question?
Sometimes you also could make a difference with doing something kind like that when someone...
You got to speak just a little louder.
Sometimes you can make a difference to someone who witnesses you doing something like that. If you are wearing the name tag of being a Christian, and somebody sees you do this, you're walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
Right.
That could make a difference to that witness.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Anyone else? So somebody's got to tell me some stories of where you see some people. Go ahead. Just wait. It's open.
So I'm coming back from Quartzsite, and when I get to Parker, I was kind of upset. So I was crying. And when I got to Parker, there was a hitchhiker just on the other side of Safeway coming this way. And I thought, you know, I'm not going to be able to drive all the curves and hills and stuff crying. And maybe if I pick up this hitchhiker, it will distract me. So I had gone on by him, and I stopped and backed up. So he threw a backpack in the back of the pickup, and he gets in. So we're visiting on our way, and I find out that he's a veteran. He's homeless. He's on his way somewhere for cancer treatment. And I was the line, whatsoever you do unto the least of these, my brethren, ye do also unto me. That came into mind. But then I also, on the other side of the coin, I'm a woman traveling alone with 2 little dogs, and it probably wasn't too smart to pick up a man on the way. But I did, and I was glad I did. He was very nice. So it worked.
Thank you. Okay. It's your turn, someone else. I can't assume that you have never done any of this. My nature as a believer will not let me think that you have never done any of this. Yes, here we go.
This has been a few years ago, but a friend of mine and I were down in Phoenix visiting one of our church members in the hospital. And he was in intensive care, so only one could go in at a time. And sitting across the aisle waiting room for us was a group of Hispanic children, some a little older, some a little younger. They were all crying. And I had this strong feeling that I needed to go over and pray with them. Well, I went over there, and they couldn't understand English, but they seemed to understand the word prayer. So we held hands and we prayed, and the gratefulness they showed to me and the feeling that I had afterwards was very meaningful. And I don't know if that was denying myself or what, but it was something that I felt God really wanted me to do.
Okay, thank you. Ever, you were going to say something last week, and then you didn't because you didn't have time. And you thought I was going to forget to call on you.
I think there we were talking about miracles.
Yes.
And I have a friend that he's 75 years old or 74 years old, whatever it is, not a young man yet, and he had a disease that, and I don't remember the name of it, but it causes proteins to build up in different organs, and in his case, the proteins were building up in his heart, and he's from Billings, Montana, but he was going to go to Milwaukee to where his son lives, and his daughter-in-law, who was a physician at this Milwaukee Medical Center, and so he was going to go there for a checkup. And they got there a few days early, so he thought, well, I'll go out and mow the lawn, have something to do. And his wife looks out the window and sees him laying on the ground and runs out there, and there's no pulse, no nothing. And she yells for the daughter-in-law to come out. The daughter-in-law come out, and because she's a physician, of course, she knew how to do CPR. She did CPR. They don't know how long he'd been laying there, but they feel like with the CPR was going on at least 7 minutes, and then the ambulance came and took him in, and he had this severe, basically, heart attack, but his heart was really pretty healthy afterwards. He come out of that, but maybe a week later, he's still in the hospital, and he had a bleeding ulcer in his abdomen, and they think it was probably also from those protein buildups. But he lost most of, they ended up putting in a transfusion of 11 units of blood, and I don't think you have more than 14 or 15, I don't know. But he was pretty near drained dry. And he come out of that, and then he got COVID. And a week later, he's pretty well cured from that, and he feels like he's had at least 3 miracles in the last 2 months. And he's trying to figure out why it is that God decided to keep him, on this earth rather than take him to the heavenly home, because he figures there has to be a reason to have that many miracles happen so quickly. And we were talking about this, some of us, Dan, I think, is mentioned that maybe the miracle is simply just telling the story.
Mm-hmm.
And that's maybe the miracle. You tell the story to the people you know.
Okay. Another hand is right there.
Sounds like my sermon from last week. Go and tell people what you've seen and heard.
We were living in northern North Dakota at one time where my husband was pastor. And it was around Thanksgiving time. And there was a knock on our parsonage door. And I answered it, and it was somebody looking for Pastor Dan, my husband. So I directed him to where the church was. And he was from Chicago. He was traveling on Highway 5, was low on gas. He didn't have any money. And so out of the emergency fund that the church had for those kinds of situations, Dan got his gas tank filled and got him a room at the motel. And he was headed to Havre, Montana from Chicago for a job. Well, the next day, a blizzard came. And so he couldn't go anywhere. And at the same time, I had been in the basement of our parsonage and my socks got wet. And so I told Dan, and our sewer was backing up. So he told this guy, his name was Bob, he said, if you help me, I'll pay you some money so you can continue your journey. So he's carrying buckets up our basement steps, and in my mind I'm thinking, could this be Jesus? And here we have him carrying up bucket loads of crap out of our basement. And he stayed a couple days. And then the weather cleared, and he had no winter clothing with him, and we had some of our son's clothing stored at our house, and so I pulled out some jackets and sweatshirts and warmer clothes for him. And about 2 weeks later, we got a card in the mail, postmarked Havre, Montana. In the corner it said Bob, and inside was a thank you card with a torn out page from some kind of book. I don't know if it was a Bible, but it was a story of the prodigal son. And he had written in his writing on the top something about coming home. And that's just a really dear story in our lives that, I had my doubts about having this person around because we didn't know him. But it turned out to be a huge blessing. For whatever happened to Bob, he impacted our lives.
Well, Bob had Jesus in him. Any other stories?
Yeah, it's a short one. During the Thanksgiving and Christmas and Easter season, I help at the local food bank give out the meals for that particular holiday. And this last Thanksgiving, a car went through, or a truck, and had a single guy in it. And he was just getting food, not the special meal. And I went over to him and I said, you can get this special meal, but you'll have to drive back through and pick up the paper. Well, he drove back, and so I went and sat down. He got out of his car and came over to me. And he said, you love Jesus? And I said, yes. And he said, I can see it in your eyes. He came back the next day to get that special meal. And he said, I know you. You're the lady that loves Jesus.
Thank you. Anyone else?
when you brought that up, I had to look around. And you would think that you'd see 3 or 4 up there, correct? But if you look on each side of the pew, there's 3 on each side of every pew in this place. And I think the reason for that is not so much an idealism. It's the reality of Christ in our lives. And it's a reminder, not an idealism. It's a living part of who we are for Christ's sake.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Anyone else? Oh, I'll tell my favorite story about my dad. I've told you this before. But it's just like Christmas. I can tell it more than once. My father ran the penny store, and the town bum was Ernie Gould. Twice a year, my dad would get some extra overalls. I don't know how he did this. But 2 to 4 times a year, he'd call Ernie in to give him a new pair of overalls. He also left money at the Unique Cafe every day for a bowl of soup and a sandwich for Ernie Gould. Ernie came to my dad's wake, went up to the casket and rubbed his hand and was mumbling something, and I asked him what he was doing, what he was saying, and you have to know my mother was there, and she said, "Be sure and get Ernie out of here before 7 because my bridge club is coming at 7. That's not the best story I can tell about my mother, but it's true. So Ernie then says to my 2 brothers and I that this was the kindest man he knew, because he left money for him for food 5 days a week. And then he was on the school board for 37 years. At that wake, there were 7 teachers who came up to us boys and said, "We wouldn't have had our job unless your dad gave us a second chance." That's just who he was. And I would have never known those stories about him if I'd have missed the wake. So don't ever miss a wake. Pay attention. It's what you hear before you come in and what you hear when you go out. What did I learn new about all of this? Any other comments? Well, you just got a foretaste today of what it means to deny yourself and pick up your cross and follow. Because you're going to be like the disciples and get 2 more stories, just like this, with some prefaces, some stories surrounding it, in Mark's 9th and 10th chapter, because he tells the story 3 times. I'm going to suffer and die and rise in 3 days. And you are to do the same thing. Deny yourself. It's kind of like, it isn't kind of like, it's like practicing dying every day. I think that's what my baptism has taught me. Yeah?
Isn't it also the resurrection? I mean, when we deny ourselves after the event and fulfillment of that, and that renewedness in us, see that? Yeah, that's for sure, but it's also a resurrection.
Yep. Anything else?
Paul, can you electrify my mic again? Let's just do a little bit of homework here as far as what we're going to do in the weeks ahead.
Okay.
So next week we will be having Bible study, but the week in between Christmas and New Year's, no? Yes?
No.
Yeah?
No.
Okay. And then probably we will start up again after New Year's.
Right.
Okay. So the week during Christmas, between Christmas and New Year's, no study, but we will meet here next week and then start again after New Year's. In January. Yep.
Okay?
All right.
Well, somehow he said you're supposed to pray like this. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.